You just saw in the film, well, first, before I tell you anything further, let me introduce myself. My name is Judith Pucci. I'm a Tribute Center walking tour guide. And as Lee just explained to you in the film, we at Tribute are all people whose lives have been directly affected by the events of that day. We're an extremely diverse group of people. We come from different ages, different backgrounds. There is such diversity that in the normal course of life, many of us would never have met. But now we share a powerful bond. And Tribute brought us together. It's where we find support, and it's where we tell our stories about what that day was like from the inside. So this afternoon, you're going to be hearing two of these stories. They're going to be told to you by the people who lived the events they will be telling you about, and they are my fellow Tribute Center guides. So next to me are Cynthia O and Dan Daly. Dan is the much easier name to pronounce. Since I'm talking about Dan, I'll tell you a little more about him. He is now a now retired battalion chief with the New York City Fire Department. That is a very impressive title. It's something to become a battalion chief, isn't it?
Well, I'm trying to hold on to it as long as I can, even though I'm retired.
It's like Mr. President, Mr. Battalion Chief.
Yes, my wife has to call me Mr. Chief.
Oh, that's very nice. I like that. Well, Dan retired in 2002, and when he retired, he had served his fellow New Yorkers for 24 years. Cynthia was an elementary school teacher. On September 11th, she was out on maternity leave. Her baby daughter, Caroline, was 4 months old at the time, and her older girl, Sarah, was 3. Cynthia's husband, I think they just look up. Cynthia's husband, come in again. Cynthia's husband, Lance Tumulty, worked for Eurobrokers. Eurobrokers was a financial services firm. They were located in the South Tower on the 84th floor. Now, the South Tower is the building that was hit second. And the building itself was 110 stories. So at the 84th floor, Lance was very near the top of the building. But we're going to begin with Dan's story. So I'm just going to very briefly set the scene for you. On September 11th, Dan was off duty. But like so many of our first responders, as soon as he heard about the attacks, he rushed here to the Trade Center to see if he could help. Dan, I'm going to let you take it from there.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here. I was home that day, and when I looked up at the sky, it was crystal clear, blue, beautiful day. And I fly a small airplane. I was thinking of flying out to Block Island. Then a phone call came and said, "Dan, did you see what happened?" And I said, "What?" They said, "Turn on the TV." And I said, "What station?" And they said, "It doesn't matter." So instantly I knew something went wrong. I turned on the TV, saw the plane hitting the building, and I instantly knew it was going to be a very, very bad day for New York and a bad day for humanity. So I jumped in my car, raced to my firehouse. I put together a team of firefighters. And we were all, at this point, still very much in disbelief. As we drove down towards the Trade Center, we could see this plume of dark, swirling black smoke in the distance. And the radios were crackling with all these messages from Ground Zero. As we entered the actual area down here, the sun was totally obscured from the sky by this black smoke, and it was like stepping into nighttime. When we got out of our vehicle, it was like being in another planet. The once proud Twin Towers were gone. People were running around covered with this thick white dust, and some had blood on them. And there was this white dust that settled over everything. It was almost surreal. It had a quiet to it, like after a snowfall. And as a firefighter down here, we walked towards the collapse area, and when we got there, it was 80 feet high, 16 acres large, and I knew there could be 50,000 people working in those buildings. So it felt so helpless standing there, with these small hand tools, and knowing that there were people in there, and yet we couldn't seem to find any. I worked for about 6 months at Ground Zero, and I saw the best of mankind and the worst of mankind. I saw the heinousness of this act itself, but then I saw the volunteers pouring in and all the help that they did. We ourselves had duties that just tore at our heart. A lot of times that we were on bucket patrol where we were looking for remains of human beings, and we'd walk around with a bucket, and when we found one, we'd gingerly put it into the bucket and then, salute it, and that remain, and then bring it back to the makeshift morgue that was in a tent nearby. It was very, very emotionally wrenching. But something strange happened. As the volunteers came in, there was almost like a spirituality that arose like a phoenix from the ashes. The volunteers came into this one area between here and the Hudson River, and they set up their tents where you could go in and get a pair of overalls or a pair of shoes. There were priests and rabbis. And it was just this place that was so beautiful with love and compassion that I called it the City of Angels. And it was such a strange dichotomy because on one side of West Street, you had this scene from Dante's Inferno of hellfire and the smell of death. And then you walked across the street to this beautiful City of Angels where you could have a cup of coffee and a hug. And there was even a cruise ship that came in, a dinner cruise ship, and served meals for 4 months. And you know what that ship was called? The Spirit of New York. Wow. And there was even a little humor there. I remember when the massage therapists first came in and they set up their tables with their clean white linen right out in this disaster area, right? And as we passed by, they'd say, hey, firefighter, hey, rescue worker, how about a massage? How about an adjustment? And of course, the macho ethic is alive and well in firefighting and construction, right? So we'd say, no, thank you. I'm just going to have a cup of black coffee and back up on the pile, right? Well, fast forward 3 months later, after everybody was bent over digging in those holes, now you had to wait online for a massage, and you had some of your biggest, burliest people on there waiting. So it really was a very, very tender place. And to me, that really spelled what 9/11 was about coming together in compassion. Remember how it felt afterwards? How everybody wanted to hug their kids and come together, and we just loved one another. Why, in New York, you could hardly hear a horn blowing for a while. I was very moved by this, and I wanted to share it with children, young people, because I thought that they took a big hit. If we thought our world was crazy, what about young people who were just inheriting this planet? So I started to reach out to young people in the area and was eventually invited to Washington, D.C., where I met Secretary Powell. And they had asked me if I would take my presentation and go overseas to 200 communities. They're having a photo exhibit of 9/11, and they wanted someone to represent that. So I had the opportunity to go to the State Department, lasted about 10 years on and off. But I'd like to share with you a little story when I first started off that inspired me and to me speaks of the whole event of 9/11. I was invited to Los Gatos, California to give a presentation, given the keys to the city, and part of my duty was to talk at all the schools I could. And I was speaking at this one school, which was a grammar school, and I wasn't speaking about 9/11 because the kids were 6, 7, 8 years old, but I was speaking about the importance of treating each other kindly and with love and respect. So after I spoke, the young children wanted an autograph, and I'm just a boy from the Bronx, so I would gladly give my autograph. So I'm signing the autographs, and I noticed that the last girl online was this beautiful little girl about 6 or 7 years old, and she even had the word cute embroidered on her dress. And she had no pen or pencil in her hand. So I'm standing here signing the autographs, looking at her, wondering what this little girl is going to do or say. So finally, when it was her turn, this precious little child walked up to me and said, I just want to give you a big hug. And she wrapped her tiny arms around me. Wow. What a powerful, powerful moment. The next day, I was in a jet heading off to Santiago, Chile to begin my presentations for the State Department. And as I sat in the plane alone looking out the window, I couldn't help but think of that little girl and how she was a little bit afraid of the world that we handed to her. And that all of us owe to that little child and to the children of all nations a world that's safe, a world all of us can be proud of. Edmund Burke said, all it takes for evil to prevail is for good people to do nothing. And that all of us must do whatever we can in our lives to be better people, to reach out. It begins in our schools, in our community, and branches out. That we ourselves can start our work on the planet with ourselves. And I would now like to conclude with a beautiful story that speaks to this sentiment that I heard while with the State Department in Sao Paulo, Brazil. It's about a school teacher. He's at home preparing a lesson plan for the next day. But his little boy keeps coming up, pulling on him. Come on, Daddy, let's play, let's play. But the father says, no, I have to finish this lesson plan. But the little boy would not give up. So the father finally had this ingenious idea. He ripped a page out of a magazine that had a picture of the world on it. And then he cut it up into the various countries like a puzzle, and he gives it to his little boy, and his little boy runs off, and the father thinks he's off the hook for half an hour, right? Wrong. 5 minutes later, the little boy comes back with it put together perfectly in his hands. And the father looks down in amazement and said, "How did you do that, son?" And the little boy said, "Easy, Dad. There was a picture of a man on the other side of that page, and when I fixed the man, the world fixed itself." So I think there's some wisdom for all of us in the words of that little boy. Thank you.
I'm going to give you a number. You may know this number, you may not. It is 343. That is the number of New York City firefighters who were killed on the morning of September 11th. They were not alone. 23 New York City police officers dead. 37 Port Authority police dead. September 11th stands as the worst loss of first responders in a single event in United States history. Now, as first responders like Dan are rushing into the Trade Center, Cynthia's husband, Lance, was one of thousands of people inside the towers who were faced with making life and death decisions. As I mentioned earlier, Lance worked high up in the South Tower. His office was within what we call the impact zone. That means that he was located on a floor where the plane entered the building. It is estimated that over 1/3 of the world watched in real time as this second plane entered the second tower. It is the only attack that morning that was broadcast as it happened. Cynthia was one of the people who watched as the plane with her husband on it went into, when the plane went into the building that her husband was in. It's all yours.
So September 11th was my 3-year-old daughter Sarah's first day of preschool. And as I was getting her ready that morning, and I had my 4-month-old in the high chair, the phone rang. And it was my husband Lance calling me from his office on the 84th floor of the South Tower. And he called to tell me to turn on the TV that something had just hit the other building, possibly a small plane. No one was sure. So I went and I turned on the TV, and I told him it wasn't even on the TV yet. So he said, "Well, I'm fine, and I love you, and I'll call you later." And with that, I hung up the phone, and I went back to getting my daughter ready for school. A little while later, my sister-in-law had arrived to watch my little one, and Sarah and I were heading out the door to go to school. And I was just about to step foot into the garage when I heard the news reporter scream, oh my God, it's a second plane," is what she said. And I turned at that exact moment to watch that second plane fly into the South Tower, where I knew my husband worked. And my knees buckled. And with that, I tried to reach him, and I couldn't get a cell. I couldn't get any service. I put my daughter in the car, and I took her to school. We got to school, and we did all the normal things that you do on the first day of school. We met our teacher, we visited the classroom, and we took our first day of school picture. And then I waited. I waited for school to be over. And when her school was over, we got back in the car, and we started on our way home. And as we got to our driveway, a little voice from the back seat said, "Mommy, why are all these people at our house?" And I did what I think any mom would do under the circumstances. I lied. And I told her that they were all there to celebrate her first day of school. As I got out of the car, I was met by friends, family, neighbors, all there and wanting to know the same thing. Where was Lance? Had I heard from him? And was he okay? And I really had hoped that he was, because someone that he worked with on the next desk in his office was at my house. I can only begin to describe what happened in those next few seconds, minutes, hours, and then days as controlled chaos, because anyone who was at my house or who came to my house took on a role. My mom's role was to help take care of my newborn daughter. My dad's role was to field phone calls. My best friend's job was to make missing posters with Lance's face on them. My other girlfriends took my daughter Sarah fun places like apple picking and Chuck E. Cheese. And my job was something that I never thought that I would do at 32 years old. I had to collect his toothbrush and his hairbrush for DNA for the chief medical examiner. And I had to collect his dental records from the dentist for identification purposes if needed. My brother-in-laws, Lance's older brothers, James and Sean, they had the most important job. Their job was to leave New Jersey every morning and head into the city and canvass the city in hopes of finding out any information they could find out about Lance. And this went on for a couple days. And after a couple days, I got a phone call that they were on their way home and that they wanted to meet with me. And I remember relaying back to them that I didn't need to have a meeting, that as soon as I saw my brother-in-law Sean's face, I would know whatever it was that he needed to tell me. And I was standing in the kitchen that night when Sean came around the corner. And he looked at me, and my knees buckled. And I knew. He didn't have to say anything. I knew what he was going to tell me. And we just gave each other a big hug because we both knew that Lance was not coming home. What they had found out through something called a Bloomberg, just like instant messaging on computers, is that Lance was standing at his desk on the 84th floor at the moment of impact. So when I had watched that plane fly into the South Tower, I had watched my husband be killed. And with that information, everyone who was at my house, we gathered out on my patio. It was a beautiful night. And there was music playing on the stereo. And we got in a big circle. And we put our arms around each other. And we sang the words to the song that was on. And these were the words that we sang. For a moment, all the world was right. How could I have known that you'd ever say goodbye? And now I'm glad I didn't know the way it all would end, the way it all would go. Thank you.
Lance died that morning with 60 of his co-workers. As of today, before Dan mentioned to you about finding human remains, we located over 20,000 human remains from the World Trade Center. As of today, 41% of everyone who died here that morning, their remains have not been identified. What that means is that that morning, a little over 1,100 people basically vanished into thin air. Lance was one of them. What I'd like to do now is just open this up to all of you. If you have any questions, we would be delighted to answer them. So just take a moment, collect your thoughts, don't be shy. No, you're all being shy. One in the back. Let me just repeat the question. The question was, is it difficult for Cynthia to share her story?
Of course. But I was a teacher before 9/11, and I feel like this is my way of helping people connect personally to, I'm only one story. You know how many people are out there on the memorial, and if I can just shed a little light into what one family went through, I hope it helps you understand the personal part of everyone's story.
Anyone else? We have time? Go, please.
Ma'am, what are your daughters' names?
Sarah is the older one, and Caroline is the younger one, and they're 16 and 13 now.
The question was the daughters' names. One more question, if anyone has it. Oh,
Dan, how has 9/11 changed your life?
how has 9/11 changed Dan's life?
Well, my whole perspective has changed in terms of life priorities. I retired from the fire department now, and I'm a sailor, so originally my idea of retirement was on my boat in the Caribbean with a pina colada in my hand. But after going through, what all of us went through at 9/11, there was a new set of priorities came to the fore. One about trying to make whatever positive difference that I could make. And it's turned into basically pretty much what I do. And I get a lot of reward from that, a lot of feedback, and I feel like I'm contributing to the planet, whereas just going off on my sailing into the sunset wouldn't be real anymore to me. So.
Thank you both. Really, thank you for doing this. It's a generous thing to do. Before we leave, you have one question? Oh, please.
I was going to ask, did the killing of Osama bin Laden bring you any solace?
I cried. I actually cried when I found out, and I was very surprised that I did. I think it was something I didn't think I would do, but for me, it was always so much more personal. That's such a even my husband died. That's so much bigger than that. But there were definitely emotions that I didn't know that I had. I remember seeing it on the news and tears. So, but solace, not in that way.
Dan, what about you?
Well, I had some friends, actually a wounded vet from Fargo was in New York, and I was down here that morning when the news broke, and the newspaper, the news was all over the place, the cameras and this and that, and I wouldn't say there was a sense of jubilation, but there was a tremendous sense of relief.
That's exactly.
And I felt a sense of relief that finally the man who did this to the 3,000 people here and the people at the Pentagon was called to task about it, and that he'll never, and more importantly, that he'll never do something like this again. Yeah, I did feel this relief, and I think everybody did that was down here.
Thank you all. Truly, this is not just a polite, happy thing that we say. I want to thank you all. You may not realize this, but you actually are essential to our storytelling, because it is with you together that we take a piece of that brutal day and we make from it a life-affirming experience. So on behalf of Tribute, on behalf of Dan, Cynthia, and me, genuinely thank you for choosing to spend some of your time with us.